and I'm here to talk to you about my chapter in Eamon Marr and myself's book, Reimagining Irish Studies. It's the 100th book in a series, which I think is an amazing tribute to the editor, Eamon. I did the first book going back a while ago now. And, you know, when you're doing a first book in a series, you wonder how many more will be, you know, will there be 20, will there be 15? And to be, you know, to get to the 100th stage is really, really impressive. It's a very eclectic series. It looks at Irish studies in all its glory, looking at history and English, which are the main, I suppose, history and literature would be the main areas that a lot of Irish studies cover. But this one looks at Catholic studies, art, fine dining, uh, literary theory, cultural theory, politics, a Franco-Irish connection, the connection between France and Ireland. It's a very polymathic series. My own chapter in this book is entitled The Dawning of Difference, Literary and Cultural Theory in Irish Studies. And I suppose what I want to do here is just to give a picture of what that's like in the book. Our brief in this book was, given that Lang we're at the 100th volume in Irish Studies. So it's kind of it's a pause and take stock book. It's trying to look at the state of aspects of the discipline now, trying to chart how we got here, and then trying to look at possible routes forward. It's a difficult chapter to write because you don't want a laundry list. We started off with, you know, Cairns and Richards, then we had Field Day, then we moved on to on the other hand, if you don't show a certain command of the field, people aren't going to be too interested in what you've got to say. The second point, of course, is the inclusivity idea. Theory, literary and cultural theory has become so polysemic at this stage that there are strands going off into all directions and you're going to miss some. So that's the other thing. I don't think that should ever stop anyone, but I think it's a caveat that has to go in. And then there's the notion of going forward. I mean, going forward is particularly interesting at the moment. You know, we've seen the post-colonial, we've seen a bit of the postmodern, we've seen the Celtic Tiger, we've seen all of those things. And I think people writing in theory now are looking at all sorts of areas, from gender, from the kind of whole idea of trans identity, the notion of thing theory, the notion of eco theory and climate criticism theory. And there'll be other ones going off as well. And I suppose what I wanted to do in this book and in this chapter is to show you, and to show people reading it, just the huge scope and diversity of it. When I did my PhD thesis in 1995, I know I don't look that old, but there you go. I was a mere child. I was 7 doing it. I was very precocious. When I did my PhD, I remember in the Viva, the extern, Chris Norris from Cardiff, read a sentence that said, I think it's very unusual, my thesis was on Seamus Heaney, very unusual to find a sentence with Heaney, Seamus Heaney, Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger in the same sentence. And if I thought of it, which I didn't, I would have put that in this chapter, because what literary theory does is it brings in a broader range of reference through which to read the text. I think as humanities, arts, social sciences, academics, our job is always to read texts. What literary and cultural theory tries to do is to give you a broader range of other texts in which to read it. So you're looking at the connection between text and context, and I talk about that in the chapter. The connection between how you write a text, that it's in a context, but that text can also change that context, and I think that's important. So in this chapter, I look at the broader theory picture, late 1960s, the big one. 1966, I suppose, would be the start of some of the huge beasts in literary theory. Jacques Lacan's Écrits was published, Michel Foucault's The Order of Things, and Jacques Derrida's Of Grammatology. And those three names would dominate, I suppose, an awful lot of literary and cultural theory. And gradually in Irish universities, they were starting to come in. So you were looking at books like Terry Eagleton's literary theory, Wellick and Warren's book on different kinds of extrinsic and intrinsic literature. You're looking at the whole, I suppose. Batsford Academic had a book on literary theory as well, and then in Irish sense, you're looking at different people. You know, Jefferson and Roby wrote them. The whole New Accents series from Methuen, Rutledge, Catherine Belsey's Critical Practice was a seminal text for most of us studying English because she was looking at it in a different way. And at that stage, people were really close. It was close reading criticism of F.R. Leavis, the American New Critics, the text as verbal icon, the text as disconnected in many ways from society. And that's what we were reading. We were reading Yeats, we were reading Heaney, we were reading all that stuff, but you're reading it in that way. The context in Irishness at the time, broadly homogenous, Catholic, white, aspirationally middle class, nationalist, Republican with a small r. That's kind of what you were looking at. And I suppose that the whole idea that what theory does is it brings in notions of difference. So at that stage in Ireland, you know, to be different, to be gay was actually illegal. You know, to be lesbian wasn't even thought of. I think it didn't come into the statute books because people didn't have the imagination to actually imagine it could happen. An awful lot of books and stuff were banned. There was an awful lot of self-censorship going on, that there were certain things that were okay and certain things that weren't. And with the gradual liberalisation of education through Donald O'Malley's programmes and then through third level, you were getting a generation of people who weren't just reading the same books. And it was a real problem for universities because you could always assume people had cultural homogeneity. It wasn't really there in terms of students reading because students were reading stuff that their lecturers maybe weren't. And I think that's part and parcel of it. So I suppose the first book that I would see as a charting point, a lynch point, would be Writing Ireland, Colonialism, Nationalism and Culture from Cairns and Richards. And that book, I know it opened my eyes big time, but it opened an awful lot of people's eyes. And then you started moving along. The whole field day movement, of course, was liberatory. Declan Kyberd, who we're delighted did a typically Declan forward to this book, which is literate and thoughtful and quizzical and looks at things in a different way. Luke Gibbons, Seamus Dean, these would be significant figures in the early stages. And you might say, oh yeah, they're all men. Yes, they are. Because feminism was starting to come into Irish culture at that stage. It wasn't quite there at that point. And of course, I talk about Field Day. Field Day it's a fascinating example of both the joy and the danger of literary and cultural theory. Literary and cultural theory tries to bring in difference. It tries to say difference is good. We need to, if there's something different coming in, we need to readjust our system to make a space, make a landing space, to use Seamus Heaney's term, for something different. The danger with that is that sometimes when you're doing that, you leave out other bits of difference. So Field Day was probably one of the major cultural enterprises that set up the thought space that we would now call contemporary Irish writing. And it fell foul hugely of the issue of gender difference when in its collection books, very few texts on women were chosen. And there was a furore and a debate. And a lot of people, and I've done a lot of reading for this text, a lot of people look back and very Irish, you know, real such of Schadenfreude there, you know, well, that shook them with their Field Day and their changing everything and they're bringing in theory. That shook them up. They got a good kick in there. They didn't. The whole purpose of literary and cultural theory is to change, and in some ways to change the very ground on which you're standing, because that's what intellectual activity is about. It's about looking at where we are, looking at where we might go, and then changing where we are in the light of that futurity. And that's very much what happened here. I mean, Field Day would have had all the big beasts of writers and thinkers. And then you had the notion of what about women and what they do. And instead of digging their heels in, which was a very classically Irish thing, and we see it particularly with more conservative forces in Ireland who will still dig their heels in and make no effort to change, to deal with the changing context. What actually happened was that there were 2 new volumes, 4 and 5, with Angela Burke, Siobhan Kilfeather, Marie Luddy, Margaret McCurtain, Maureen Nigonica, Mary O'Dowd, Claire Wills, Geraldine Meany, and others who were given voices and who took voices, given is probably the wrong word, but who took vocal control and agency of women's writing. And I think the amount of, and we have a fantastic chapter here by Maureen O'Sullivan, the amount of women writers now probably will have a debt to that particular contretemps, that gap. And what happened there, of course, was what Jacques Derrida would call the logic of supplementarity. The books were published as a collective unity. The supplement, says Derrida, is something that adds to something else. But if the something else originally was seen to be complete, does the supplement add something more? Does it change it? What does it do? I've only got a few minutes here, so I can't talk about that. Derrida has 2 books in it, which are absolutely fascinating. Field Day 4 and 5 supplemented Field Day 1, 2, and 3. And there was a new entity created. And that new entity in itself would probably be subject to question from a theoretical perspective and viewpoint. You could say, well, an awful lot of the people in it are middle class or some way landed. What about working class poetry? What about working class work and stuff like that? And that's what theory does. So the dawning of difference becomes something that is crucial. Does this have any activity, any valence in the broader world? Yeah, it does. I think it's no accident that we were one of the first countries to bring in same-sex marriage referendum, because an awful lot of literary and cultural theory would look at there's a whole strand called queer theory, would look at issues of gender and gender orientation and look at those and see how they work. And this is all part and parcel of what we're trying to do in the book. I mean, in my one, I talk about performance studies. We talk about all sorts of issues to do with what's happening now, with issues of the future, issues of politics, issues of post-colonialism. All of those areas, I suppose, are part and parcel of what we're doing. And to take a broader stance on the book, in many ways, this whole book and the whole series deals with notions of difference and notions of what Irish studies can be and might not be. Michael D. Higgins, in his Machnamh series of seminars, is looking at issues of the past, looking at empire, looking at how we dealt with empire, how we spoke about empire. I think this book in particular would be treading a parallel path. But whereas the Machnamh series are looking at the present and how the past needs to be revisited, I think we're looking at the present and maybe how the future needs to be reimagined. And that, I think, takes us nicely back into the title of the series, Reimagining Ireland, the title of this particular book, Reimagining Irish Studies, and the title of my own chapter, The Dawning of Difference. So if you get a chance, I hope you read it, I hope you like it, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the chapters. Thanks very much.